Greetings. Last time we did a walkthrough of the Eprom programmer, model 4801, and demonstrated most of the functions, but we left the best for last. And what remains, first of all, is communicating with the device, i.e. you want to burn an Eprom. How do you get the data onto it? And for that, the programmer is equipped with an RS-232 port. It communicates at 9600 baud, which is not changeable. And we get a DB25 and need to find something to plug this into. Now, unfortunately, the programmer is not controllable remotely. What that means is you can't just hook it into a serial port and then type ASCII commands in and emulate the keyboard. The reason for that is this doesn't have a UART chip, but rather bit bangs the communications. And thus, because it does all the timing with the processor, I guess it can't be alive all the time, monitoring the incoming data. And thus, the way it works is if you want to, option 2 is RS-232 transmit. And the way that works is, let's turn it on. So you're manually starting it down a transmission. And we use our function select. It asks for the low address or the first address. I always mistake that L for last. I mean for length or low or whatever. But anyway, the L is the last address, so we want to send 256 bytes. Then it says load, prompting you to hit the load button. And it'll sit there transmitting, and it's done. Conversely, if you want to receive data, there's a function which is called RS-232 receive. You hit load, and when it actually receives data, the dash will come on here and tell you that it's receiving data. Again, the big question is, what do we plug this into? And what kind of software do we run on the other end? In the paperwork I got, there is reference and a user manual to a IBM PC DOS program that does this for you, but there was no disk included. I couldn't find the software online, and frankly I didn't want to deal with it. So I kind of rolled my own here. Now I forgot to mention, of course, if you haven't watched part 1 of this series, then please do so, because otherwise things may not make a whole lot of sense to you. I will leave the link in the description below. So back to the issue at hand, we need to plug this into something. Preferably a DB25 male. Well, that was easy. Here's a DB25 male. It only has 3 wires coming out of it: ground, transmit, and receive. Now, RS-232 originally used plus minus 15 volt signal levels, and if you plug that into anything TTL compatible, bad things will happen, obviously. So we need a level converter, and of course we also need a USB to serial converter. They're a dime a dozen. They're all over the place, but most of those are TTL compatible. So I basically rummaged through the stuff I had And even though this may seem odd to you, here's the most convenient one I found. It's an Arduino, most notably with the CPU missing, because all we really need is the USB to serial converter over here. Let's bring that in a little closer. Yeah, which is this guy. And then we hook it up to the PC through that USB connector. And we have serial coming in and out of data 0 and data 1 of these two pins. The reason the processor is removed is we don't want it interfering, trying to send on those pins, and we don't need the processor. We only need the USB to serial converter. So, a piece of the puzzle missing, of course, is we need to plug this in somewhere here. This is at plus minus 15 volts. This is at 0 to 5 volts. So we got to do level conversion. Not a big deal, can generally be done with 2 transistors. But you also need a power supply so that the sent data gets, stepped up to plus minus 15 or whatever voltage you want to go to. You don't have to go to 15 volts. RS-232 will actually recognize anything above a magnitude of 6 volts. But of course, the higher the voltages, the more protection you have against signal degradation or voltage degradation. But doing it on the desktop, even 6 volts would do it fine. But in order to not have to connect yet another power supply to the converter board, we used something else. And that brings us to the last piece of the hardware puzzle. This is an Arduino shield, and instead of using transistors, what I'm using is a MAX232 chip. It's a very interesting chip, runs off a single 5 volt supply, but it has charge pumps on here, and along with these capacitors here, it is able to generate plus minus 10 volts. Very painless. So this is going to be able to talk to the programmer with high and inverted voltages. And of course, the other end of it talks 5 volts to the Arduino serial port. And here's our completed rig. We got the programmer coming in over here, and we got this going to the PC. And nothing's going to smoke, nothing's going to catch on fire, I hope. But the specs look good. So remember, we solved the hardware part here. Now what we need to do is solve the software part. Oh, and before I forget, the programmer does not communicate in binary, but rather it utilizes Intel hex, which is ASCII, which needs to be decoded to turn it into binary. So I did try a few things. I started off with the Arduino serial monitor, which works, but it's all Intel hex, it's all text. And you have to cut and paste it, and then write a utility to extract the binary from it, and vice versa. You got to take a binary file, turn it into Intel hex, and paste it into the Arduino window. I also looked into some other stuff. Let's see, what did I try? I tried PuTTY, and I tried something else, but none of them support Intel hex. They work. I can see data coming in and sending out data, but it's really cumbersome getting Intel hex to go. So I basically built my own. This didn't take very long. Visual Studio makes these kinds of trivial tasks very easy to implement. But in order for us to get data from the programmer, remember again, we cannot command it remotely. So when this runs, I just happen to know that the Arduino is on port COM4. We open it, and now we got to go to the programmer and tell it to send, to transmit RS-232. We use function 2. We enter the first address. We enter the last address, and now it's prompting us for load. And oh, I forgot one thing. Can't do that yet because the first thing we have to do is basically copy the Eprom to RAM on the programmer, which happened quickly. So now we go back and we tell it to transmit from 0 to 07FF, and off we go. You can obviously see a whole bunch of FFs here, but that's because the ROM I'm using is from the ETA 3400 and the first half of it is blank, but we can see some actual data coming in. It's pretty slow. I mean, 9600 isn't fast, but it isn't this slow. What it looks like they're doing is after every line of Intel hex is generated and sent, they put like a 500 millisecond or more pause in there to make sure that the PC is able to I guess decode this and put it in memory. And I will demonstrate that when we are sending data to it. And that's the same thing again. I mean, what we do though, we have to set the programmer into receive mode, and it says press load, and that means it is now ready to receive stuff. And we have a few files. Oh, it's already open. I meant to click this. And this is the file we want to send, which is the ET3400. Now note how much faster this will go, because I'm not delaying after each line is sent. And the program crashed. Sorry about that. I think what happened was I tried to open an already opened serial port, and strange things started to happen. I'll fix that, or maybe I won't. I'll just be more careful to open the correct serial port only once. Alright, so now we got to go back to the programmer and tell it, put it into receive mode, which is function 3. Gave me the load prompt and it's waiting. So now we go to send, and test.bin is an earlier image I made of the ETA 3400 ROM. And you will notice that it is definitely going faster. So it basically has a true throughput of 9600 baud. And there you go. So now when we want to burn any other EPROMs, because it reads binary files, we can basically read any binary file, send it over, and we already saw in the last episode that it actually burns the EPROM. So what remains is the simulate or emulate function, which isn't described very well. Well, I mean, you select function, simulate, and everything should work. However, digging through the manual is you need to make your own custom personality module, which looks like this. Well, that's the one I made. And what it really allows you to do is allows an external device, takes the chip select and makes the chip select all of the internal RAM here. But you could say, wait a minute, how does that work? I mean, the Z80 is talking to memory in here all the time, and the memory is not buffered. So the CPU is hooked directly to the RAM memory in here, but there's a rather clever circuit that when you press function select 4, which is simulate, it writes to a certain memory location that pulls the wait pin on the Z80 low. What the wait pin is, it's like the wait pin puts the processor to sleep, and it relinquishes the address bus or tri-states the address and data buses and control signals, and basically leaves the memory at the mercy of whatever else wants to talk to it. Now, you can get out of simulate mode, and the way that works is they cleverly hooked up the function switch, the function select switch. Am I pointing off screen? Probably am. The red button over here, that is directly connected to the non-maskable interrupt pin on the Z80. So when you hit that button, the processor wakes up immediately and takes action. So that's how you get out of simulate mode. You don't have to power cycle it. And of course your target device at that point will be going bananas because it has, well, actually it might go bananas too, because if the target device is still trying to access RAM or write to RAM, well, it shouldn't be writing to RAM because it has an Eprom connected, but yes, the target device will go bananas. So with that said, let's go ahead and install the custom personality module and see if we can get the Heathkit to power up in simulator mode. Okay, we're all set up. We have our custom personality module that allows an external device to access RAM in here. We did download the image to RAM. And then we have a ribbon cable that plugs into the ROM socket on the Heathkit. So all we need to do now is tell the Eprom programmer go to simulate mode, which is indicated by dashes in the display, and then turn on the Heathkit. And there you go. No smoke, no mirrors, no hidden ROMs. It's feeding from the programmer over here. And again, we can try out, if it goes beyond the sign up message, but we can examine memory, we can display registers, and let's see, can we reset it? Let's find out. Yes. So it's fully functional, and now, so you could use this obviously to write custom software for the Heathkit or whatever you get hooked up to it. Now, one interesting thing is if you would think that you could go in here, take it out of simulate mode, and then manually change parameters on the programmer, i.e. change RAM, and then power this one back up again and see your changes. However, that doesn't seem to work. So if I turn off the target and I go back to address, so I'm not even changing anything. I mean, what I'm talking about is, let's say you type in an address. Let's take the very first byte, which is at, with reference to 0, is at 0400. Oh, I shouldn't be changing that. But those are all, those were all FFs. So we can restore that to Remember, the first half was all FFs. But what we do want to do is go to 0400. There's an 8E, and we could change that. Well, if we change it, it's not going to work, but just to demonstrate, we go in here and change 8E to 65, and it auto advances, and then we change it back to 8E, which means we were in here, and we actually changed the contents of RAM. So now what happens, if we go back into simulate mode, will it still work? It does. I was wrong. I spoke too soon. If we look at the RAM contents, they got totally corrupted. And, well, that's why the Heath is going bananas. And I think that happened because I came out of simulate mode without turning this off. So there was a lot of bus contention, and somehow this thing wrote to RAM and destroyed things. But if done properly, you can actually sit there and do local changes by changing single memory addresses, or you could download a brand new ROM image that you've created and test it out. So before this self-destructs, let me turn off the heat. And as you can see, everything kind of works. It's very fiddly. You got to be very careful with this, but it does work when used properly. There are better ways to do this. There were a few other ROM burners out there that also offered simulate mode because it comes naturally. The ROM programmer or Eprom programmer has RAM on it, and simply by allowing access to the RAM by an external source, which normally on an Eprom is the chip select pin, if chip select goes low, take the processor out of the equation on the programmer and have the RAM selected. And there you go. Now you know how a ROM simulator works, and that they actually do work, and that this is a really neat piece of equipment which is mostly useless nowadays, but not for me, because that is the only reliable way I have of programming a 2716. Thanks for watching. Thumbs up would be appreciated. Leave me your comments, and we'll see you in the next episode.